We'll finish up this lesson on preparation with a look at the critical issue of driving under the influence. Up until now, this lesson has focused on how important preparation is for safe driving. Let me be frank with you. If you're under the influence of alcohol, drugs, or controlled substances, or as it is known in Indiana, OWI, operating while intoxicated, you are not prepared to drive. Although it's called OWI, this does not just refer to drinking and driving. OWI laws are enforced regardless of the cause of your intoxication. It can be alcohol. Sadly, that's what it is most of the time. But it can also be any type of illegal drug. That can mean any Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 controlled substance. That would include opiates, cocaine, methamphetamine, hallucinogens, including marijuana, and so on. Indiana has among the harshest regulations in the country. It can also be prescribed medications. Some medications available by prescription are Schedule 2 drugs. We discussed this briefly when talking about older drivers, since this age group is more often prescribed these medications. But it can happen with drivers of any age. Take seriously the advice of your physician or pharmacist not to drive after taking a medication. But as I said, the most common and most hazardous is related to drinking and driving. Any driver found to have a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08 is guilty of OWI, with harsher penalties kicking in if the blood alcohol is 0.15% or more. For a driver below the legal drinking age, in other words, a driver aged 15 to 20, blood alcohol concentration of 0.02 is considered OWI. For controlled substances, Indiana has no minimum levels. Any controlled substance found in a sample taken from a driver is sufficient to prove OWI in Indiana. But to be clear, you can also be charged with OWI in Indiana for any level of blood alcohol. If whatever you've ingested is enough to intoxicate, you can be found guilty of OWI in Indiana. The penalties in Indiana are among the harshest in the country. That includes some of the longest license suspensions, jail time, and required use of ignition interlock devices of any state. Only Vermont has sterner penalties. But it's not the possible penalties that are the best reason to never drive when you're under the influence of alcohol, drugs, or medication. Let's look at what happens to you when you drink alcohol. The first thing it does is it blocks the chemical signals between the neurons in your brain. Your neurons are your brain cells. When brain cells can't exchange signals, that's what causes all the effects of intoxication. This includes slowed reflexes, slurred speech, poor memory, and impulsive, out-of-control behavior. All of these begin with your first sip and become more intense as the amount of alcohol increases. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, a 160-pound man has decreased ability to track a moving target. In other words, taking longer to react when a response is needed, and reduced multitasking ability after just 2 alcoholic beverages. Large consumptions of alcohol, especially on an empty stomach and in a short period of time, can lead to blackout, which doesn't always mean passing out. It might mean memory loss, extremely poor judgment, and a total inability to complete simple tasks. Throughout the class, we've been talking about the challenges of driving. Those challenges are tough enough when we're not intoxicated. Do you really want to face all of that, even with the modest loss of abilities after you've had 1 or 2 drinks? What makes drinking and driving so necessary to control tightly is that the same effects on brain cells that causes alcoholic intoxication makes it harder to judge how much our reactions, our memory, decision-making, and coordination have been affected. As our reactions slow, our entire brain also slows. So it feels like our reactions are normal, but they're not. A person who's intoxicated is no longer a good judge of whether he or she is capable of driving. As bad as all this is, it gets worse. We now know that drinking alcohol to excess over a long period of time results in measurable loss of brain mass. Your brain shrinks if you drink. This happens because your brain releases chemicals to right the intoxication. These chemicals burn out brain cells if they're around too long or too often. Those brain cells are gone for good. Now we get to the part that I truly hope will scare any of you who might think drinking and driving isn't such a big deal. Surveys have found that about 1.5% of drivers in Indiana at night and on weekends have blood alcohol levels of 0.08 or above. Despite this, 15% of the vehicle crashes include at least one driver above the legal limit. 1.5% of drivers are responsible for 15% of crashes. That means you're 10 times as likely to be in a car crash if you're intoxicated. It gets worse. Nearly 40% of fatal accidents involve at least one driver whose blood alcohol is over the legal limit. In 2017, for example, according to NHTSA, there were 914 traffic fatalities in Indiana. 362 of them had at least one alcohol-impaired driver. That means you're more than 25 times as likely to be killed when driving drunk. That's partly because drunk drivers are more likely to speed than other drivers. The combination of slowed reactions, poor memory and judgment, and increased speed is deadly. There are other victims in these crashes. Nearly 4 in 10 of those killed in vehicle crashes across the country where a drunk driver was involved were walking, a passenger, or in another vehicle. In other words, they weren't drinking and were killed by a drunk driver. In 2016, according to NHTSA, 214 children aged 14 and younger died in the U.S. car accidents involving a drunk driver. We've been talking so far about alcohol, but a lot of the same goes for a driver who's taken illegal drugs or certain prescription medications. We see slowed reactions, poor memory and judgment, decreased ability to multitask, and so on. I don't want this all to be bad news. The good news is that the number of drivers who've consumed alcohol has been falling steadily. The enforcement efforts of Indiana and other states have had a profound effect. According to the CDC, drivers who report having driven after drinking alcohol has declined by about a third since 2006. NHTSA reports that surveys of alcohol-impaired drivers show a more than 75% decline since NHTSA began studying it in 1973. But during the same period of time, there's been a marked increase in those who are driving with at least some level of prescribed medication or illegal substance revealed in blood tests. A recent NHTSA survey found that 22% of drivers tested positive for at least one drug that could affect safety. That includes illegal drugs as well as prescription and over-the-counter medications. Unlike with alcohol, these drivers were not more likely to speed than other drivers, but less likely to do so. Nevertheless, be aware that OWI can mean any type of intoxication, and any level of intoxication will make you less prepared to drive. That means less able to react when you need to, and more likely to hurt yourselves or others. And please, please never drive or let anyone else drive after you've been drinking until enough time has passed and your reactions are back to normal. And have somebody else be the judge of that. That completes this lesson. After another short quiz, we'll continue on in the next lesson with the skills needed for defensive driving.